Welcome, Dr. Epic here. Now, wars don't begin like we think they do. War doesn't start when somebody blows a whistle and then everybody starts fighting. That's not how it happens. Wars start when a bunch of little fights get bigger and bigger over time. War starts when little wars turn into bigger wars, and they sort of snowball into larger and larger military conflicts. And the Second World War is no exception to this. The Second World War didn't start for everybody at the same time, but rather the Second World War started as a series of little wars that kept getting larger and more violent and eventually combined into the Second World War itself. And that's what we're going to discuss here today. How all of these little wars end up being this one huge, massive war by the time you get to 1941. And along the way, we're going to see German Condors. We're going to learn about screaming horses. We're going to taste panzer-chocolate. We're going to watch Captain America punch Hitler. We're going to study all about the arsenal of democracy. We're going to gaze upon the flying tigers in the sky. And we're going to see when a sleeping giant finally awakens. We're going to follow that outline right up above my head. So put that in your notes to serve as a framework for the information that's about to follow as we begin to build more and more of an answer to a single large question. And there it is on the left. Evaluate FDR's Germany First policy. What was its goal? What did it cost? What did it lead to? Were Marshall and King correct, or even half right? In light of how the Second World War developed, was Germany First a wise decision, especially given the alternatives? How did it shape the post-war world? Now, last time we studied the rise of the three most violent and aggressive nations known to modern history: Fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, and Imperial Japan. And now we're going to watch those countries go to war. Because again, World War II did not start as a single massive conflict, but rather it started as a series of much smaller wars that then spiraled completely out of control. Now, these nationalist socialist powers that we talked about last time, Italy, Germany, Japan, they needed to militarily subjugate their neighbors. It's built into the ideology. And the old liberal democracies, these guys saw those old liberal democracies as being too weak, too feeble to stop the vigorous military expansion of the fascist powers. Now, this gets started with Fascist Italy. For Fascist Italy, it begins with a military invasion of the last free kingdom in Africa, the invasion of Ethiopia in 1935. The Italian armies invade Ethiopia. Outnumbered, unequipped, and alone, the kingdom of Ethiopia fought surprisingly well. They fought like African lions, and they defeated Italian army after Italian army. For 2 years in Africa, they beat back the Italians, often using nothing more complicated than spears and swords and shields and bows and arrows against Italian tanks, Italian planes, and Italian machine guns. Mussolini, frustrated that he can't just pound the Ethiopians into submission, eventually resorted to large-scale terror tactics, mass bombing Ethiopian cities, machine gunning Ethiopian villages, murdering tens of thousands of Africans to blast his way through Ethiopian resistance, eventually even using poison gas on both soldiers and civilians. And you can see him right there with the gas masks trying to recover from an Italian gas attack. By 1937, Italian forces captured the capital of Ethiopia, Addis Ababa, and the Ethiopian army itself collapsed, although individual Ethiopians would refuse to surrender, and they fought on for years in the countryside of Africa. And for all of the violence and the terror done by Fascist Italy in Ethiopia, the Western democracies did nothing. They feebly complained, Italy, you really shouldn't do that. But again, The National Socialist countries have no respect for the Western democracies. To the east in Asia, Imperial Japan saw in mainland China a nearly endless supply of farmland, of iron, of coal, all the things that the Japanese home islands lack. Now, the only problem with all these resources is that there's like Chinese people already living there. But that is a problem that Imperial Japan thinks it can solve. Now, China itself at the time was very weak and divided. It had been home to its own civil war since 1930, with the nationalist Chinese fighting the communist Chinese. And in 1932, Japan launches the first of what will be several Sino-Japanese wars. In 1932, Imperial Japan invades northern China, an area called Manchuria. There is a year of fighting across northern China, which results in a full Chinese capitulation. There's a few years of relative peace, which ends in 1937, when again Imperial Japan launches a military invasion of central China itself. Now, their goal is to seize the Yellow River, clear it of its Chinese population, and obtain those resources for Imperial Japan. Now, to call this invasion brutal is an understatement. Imperial Japan saw the Chinese as subhuman, Untermenschen. To Imperial Japan, the Chinese are not really people. Imperial Japan encouraged its soldiers to rape and murder Chinese civilians, often giving awards when a particular soldier had killed 100 Chinese civilians. Particularly brutal was an event called the Rape of Nanking in 1937. Now, Nanking is a city in China. And when the Japanese army captures this major Chinese city, it basically unleashes its soldiers on the population of the city. And what results is this orgy of rape, of murder, of massacre. The Japanese kill more than 250,000 Chinese inside Nanking. In total, during these first two Sino-Japanese wars, the Japanese kill somewhere between 4 and 5 million Chinese, die in these various Japanese atrocities. It is shocking. The world is horrified. And the Western democracies, France, Britain, America, they do nothing. They do absolutely nothing. Now, the Great Depression had hit Spain particularly hard, and suffering very greatly from the Great Depression, the entire nation of Spain itself just cracks right in half between the Republican and the pro-fascists. The pro-fascist general, Francisco Franco, that's him right in the center, tries to launch a coup d'etat, and it is not a successful coup d'etat, but Franco was able to seize large portions of the Spanish countryside, and he remained in control of most of the Spanish army. And what resulted was a fight between the Spanish government and the Spanish army. This is the Spanish Civil War, and it will last between 1936 and 1939. And it's a clash between Spain's army, which becomes known as the Nacionales, and Spain's government, which is the Republicanos. And Francisco Franco was worried about winning this war, so he asks his fellow fascist nations for help. He asks Nazi Germany for help. He asks fascist Italy for help. And both Nazi Germany and fascist Italy send help to help Francisco Franco win the Spanish Civil War. And France and Britain and America, the Western democracies, what do you think they did? Well, if your answer is nothing, then you are correct. They did absolutely nothing. Now, Italy sends its fleet, and Italy's got a really nice fleet cruising around the Mediterranean. So these Italian battleships blockade the coast of Spain, and they start firing at Republican positions inland, and they really help out the pro-fascist Spanish. But it's what the Germans do that's most interesting, because the Germans are trying out new methods of warfare. So the Germans send to Spain a group of aircraft, and it becomes known as the Condor Legion. And this is specific aircraft, and they're going to test out new tactics of terror bombing civilian targets. And that's the experiment that the Germans launch during the Spanish Civil War. In fact, the only people who send help to to help out the legitimate Spanish government are the communists. Soviet Russia starts to send men and materials and guns and cannons to help out the Spanish government. And very quickly, the Spanish government goes full communist. So the Spanish Civil War is this very ugly struggle between the pro-fascist army and the pro-communist government, while the Italian Navy is blasting them along the coast and the German Air Force is trying out new tactics of terror bombing. Now, there was this one town in northern Spain, and it was called Guernica. And the fascists had been told, look, there are no military targets at Guernica. Guernica is where we want to send women and children to get them away from the fighting. Are you okay with that, pro-fascists? And the pro-fascists hear about this town called Guernica, but instead of saying, okay, this town is filled with women and children, we're just going to leave it alone, they give the coordinates of Guernica to the German Condors. And the German Air Force moves in and terror bombs the city flat. Guernica is a horrific massacre launched from the air. And news of Guernica gets out across the world, and everyone is incredibly and deeply shocked that the Germans specifically targeted a town set up to be a refuge for women and children. And one of the people that hears about the horrible slaughter at Guernica is the great Spanish artist Pablo Picasso. And he's in Paris at the time, and he has almost this like mental breakdown when he hears about the tragedy of the massacre at Guernica. And as the result, he starts grabbing this canvas and he paints one of the most terrifying and famous paintings of all time. This mural, it's 25 feet long and 11 feet high. The painting is massive because this is the painting known as Guernica. It shows screaming horses, confused bulls, dying women reaching up for the sky. It is emphasizing the horror that these new German tactics are having upon the world. And Guernica is a terrifying painting. It's terrifying to look at. It is a deeply unsettling piece of art because it is dedicated to this horrible massacre that took place during the Spanish Civil War. But Nazi Germany is not satisfied. Italy gets to invade Africa. Imperial Japan gets to invade China. Nazi Germany is not finished with its expansion across Central and Eastern Europe. And Germany's next target is Poland. Convinced that the Western democracies will do nothing, Hitler and Stalin make a secret pact to both invade Poland and divide the entire country between them. And they make a deal, and the deal is called the Molotov-Ribbentrop Act, in which they decide to take poor Poland, which hasn't been hurting anybody, and slice it right down the middle. Both the Nazi armies and the communist armies attack the Polish. And in the face of this, both Britain and France say, look, Hitler, look, Nazi Germany, if you actually go through with this plan, if you actually invade Poland, we will declare war. This is too much. This is too far. But Hitler didn't believe them. Why would he? All right. They stood by and did nothing when the Italians gassed Ethiopians in Africa. France and Britain stood by and did nothing when Japan murders an entire city of Nanking. France and Britain didn't do anything when the Germans massacre women and children at Guernica. Why would Hitler believe that somehow they're going to go to war over Poland? They're going to go to war to protect Polish democracy? They're going to go to war to protect the integrity of Poland's borders? He doesn't think they'll do it. And on September 1st, 1939, the German tanks smash across the border and invade Poland. They are accompanied by Soviet-Russian tanks invading from the east. But Hitler had finally gone too far. 2 days later, both the Republic of France and the United Kingdom both declare war on Nazi Germany. And this is the moment where most historians go, September 1st, 1939. World War II has begun. But everybody points out how utterly weird the Molotov-Ribbentrop Act is. And they point this out in these kind of silly cartoons. Again, the National Socialists of Germany absolutely and totally hate the International Socialists of Russia. The Nazis hate, the Soviets. I mean, they hate each other more than anything else. Why would they suddenly agree? Well, for one thing, they really want to divide Poland in half, but everybody points out that both Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia are natural ideological enemies. And everyone is pointing out that this alliance between these two deadly enemies cannot last very long. There's a cartoon with Stalin on one side and Hitler on the other, and they both have revolvers hidden behind their back. There's a cartoon right up above my little yellow box, which shows Hitler is the groom and Stalin is the bride, and they're saying, how long will the honeymoon last? Absolutely everyone knows that it's only a matter of time before the Molotov-Ribbentrop Act falls apart. And the Germans try new techniques with their invasion of Poland. This is the first time they try something new. It's called the Blitzkrieg. And the Blitzkrieg is an entire new way of conducting armored warfare. What they do is they adapt infantry tactics from the First World War, where they used special groups of soldiers called stormtroopers to smash through the enemy lines and to sow confusion and discord amongst their opponents. Except for the Blitzkrieg, they're not using special groups of infantry. They're not using stormtroopers. They're using armored tanks. And the way Blitzkrieg works, you can see the diagram there to the left. The tanks smash through one point in the line and then push through and then circle back around to attack the other troops on the rear. And they break through and head for major cities. They blow up bridges. They tear through intersections. And the goal of the Blitzkrieg is to cause maximum demoralization and maximum confusion. And behind the tanks come the mechanized infantry to mop up the confused, broken enemy army. And the Blitzkrieg works incredibly well. The poor Polish army never stood a chance against the Blitzkrieg. Even though they fought valiantly, they also died bravely. But they still died. The next on the German hit list is, surprisingly, the nations of the North, Denmark and Norway. Now, why did Hitler attack North? Hitler attacks North for basically just one very simple reason. During the First World War, Norway had been a really valuable ally of Great Britain, and Norway is home to really large iron deposits, and Hitler wants access to those iron deposits. And there was a lot of resentment against Norway because they were seen as like a fellow Nordic nation, but they had been such good allies of the British in the First World War. No longer. He's going to punish the Norwegians for having befriended the British back in 1914. And in April of 1940, the Germans smash north and completely take the Danes by surprise. They completely overwhelm the Kingdom of Denmark, and they attack along the coast and across into southern Norway. And April, May, June, within 3 months, they completely overwhelm and smash the Kingdom of Norway. The Norwegians fight quite hard, and again, they put up an incredible fight, but they are just no match for the Germans. There's too many Germans, the Germans are incredibly mechanized, and the Germans can do things that doesn't even seem humanly possible. You have these German units, they can march for 2 days, fight a battle, recover from the battle, march for another 4 days, fight a second battle, recover from that, and then march for 3 more days and capture a major city. And they can do the whole thing with almost no sleep, with very little food or water. People are like, oh my goodness, what is up with these German soldiers? They move incredibly well. They fight incredibly hard. They seem to not suffer from fatigue or hunger or thirst. It's incredible. Now, the German propaganda says, well, it's because Germans are just racially superior. The German soldier can march for days. The German soldier doesn't need to eat but once a week. The German soldier can sip a little bit of water and be good for days. I mean, of course, none of that was true. Because in addition to the Blitzkrieg, these new tactics, the Germans also had another secret weapon that they had used in large numbers. And the secret weapon was drugs. They were basically pumping all of their army and all of their sailor full of methamphetamines. The methamphetamines would be fed to the soldiers generally in form of pep pills like Pervitin that you can see here. But it was also, the much more popular way it was distributed was through chocolate. They had this special chocolate called panzer-chocolate. There it is, and right up above me. It would be a disc of chocolate, and it's got a lot of chocolate in it. It has a lot of sugar in it. It had a ton of caffeine in it, and it also had meth, all right? Now, can you actually do all of that on meth? And the answer is yeah, you can march for 3 days. You can fight a battle. You can recover from the battle. You can march another 3 days. You can fight another battle, and you can do the whole thing without any food. You know, if you're just pumping enough methamphetamines into your soldiers, they can do all of that. Now, their hearts will eventually explode in a year or two, but who cares what happens in a year or two? You need to win the battles now, all right? And everybody knew that the Germans were fighting like this. Everybody knew that they had completely demolished the Polish. Everybody knew that in 3 months they had smashed both Denmark and Norway. Everybody knew France was next, but France had a plan. They have a mighty army. They stopped the Germans back in 1914. The Republic of France will stand, and they prepare themselves for the inevitable German onslaught. And in May of 1940, that onslaught comes, and the Germans smash right through the French army. They blow through it like it's not even there. They smash their way through the West. The Netherlands collapse on May 1940. They just breeze through Belgium in less than 3 weeks. France, which thought it could hold out for years against the Germans, lasts May, April, June. 3 months. The mighty Republic of France is smashed by the German blitzkrieg. The German tanks smash through the French armies, race through French cities, surround French armies, and the entire French army is completely taken by surprise. They're completely baffled. The great sacrifices they made back in the First World War are a distant memory. The French are completely and utterly smashed, and eventually they admit it. On June 14th, 1940, the Republic of France surrenders to Nazi Germany. Hitler himself tours the defeated city of Paris. And there you can see right up above, the French are completely stunned by the scale of their defeat. They'd never seen anything like this before. But not all the French are willing to surrender. A single general, Charles de Gaulle, refuses the order to surrender. He grabs his soldiers and makes a break for the coast, carrying the French flag, carrying the colors of his regiments. They load on ships and they escape to England. They escape to Africa. Because Charles de Gaulle makes an announcement to the French nation. He makes an announcement to the French army, and he says, I refuse to accept this surrender. France will never surrender. Join us overseas and we will continue the fight for free France. And they make a special flag. We are fighting against the unchristian and ungodly forces of the Nazis. God is on our side. And they put the cross in the middle of their flag. Charles de Gaulle refuses to surrender. But a lot of the French do surrender. A lot of the French have no choice to surrender, but a lot of French make it overseas, and they swell a free French army that will continue to fight for the duration of the war. The British army is trapped inside of France that has already surrendered, and it has got to get out immediately. The British army makes a break for the coast, abandoning equipment, abandoning their tanks, abandoning their ammunition, abandoning their artillery. It is a mad scramble to escape from the tightening circle of the Nazis as the Nazis close in on a British army that is just trying to get out of France as quick as it can. And this is the very famous Battle of Dunkirk, in which the British army has made it to the coast. It's made it to the port of Dunkirk. But the Royal Navy doesn't have enough ships to pick them up, to carry them back over to England. So the Prime Minister of Britain calls out a general order. Anyone with a ship, if you've got a boat, a yacht, a fishing trawler, anyone with a ship that can cross the channel, get across the channel, bring back our boys. and the British public responds in massive numbers. Thousands of tiny little boats cross the English Channel, picking up British soldiers by fives, tens, 20s. And the British army escapes the clutches of Nazi Germany. They get back to England. But they're an army without rifles. They're an army without ammunition. They abandoned all of their equipment, in their desperate plight to escape France. And all of their allies are gone. France is gone. Belgium is gone. Poland is gone. Great Britain is alone. And they are worried. And Hitler makes an offer to Great Britain. Surrender, and you will receive very generous terms. Winston Churchill, the new prime minister who replaces the feckless Neville Chamberlain, refuses to surrender. And he says, we will continue to fight. And to punish the British, Hitler unleashes the Air Force. And he says, do to Britain what you guys did to Guernica. And the German Air Force responds. Through July, August, September, October of 1940, for 4 months, the Germans unleash large-scale terror bombing across the whole of Britain, attacking from air bases in France, attacking from air bases in Germany. Their goal is to kill as many people as possible, to force the British to capitulate. And the British refuse. The British continually fight off the German bombers. They throw up fighter after fighter after fighter against the German bombers. In his frustration, Hitler cannot force the British to surrender. So he orders the German Air Force, instead of targeting a bunch of cities, put all bombers over London, destroy the city of London. And this becomes known as the Blitz, B-L-I-T-Z, the mass terror bombing of the city of London. The Germans attempt to turn London into Guernica. Their goal is to simply kill as many people as possible. It is a complete and total failure. The British refuse to be moved. The British refuse to surrender. They dig in their heels and they start shooting down German plane after German plane after German plane. By the time you get to October of 1940, the German Air Force has to admit it has lost the Battle of Britain. They've killed a bunch of people in London, but the will to fight is only stronger among the British people. They will not cave in. So he can't bomb them into submission. So Nazi Germany decides to starve the British into submission. And just like they did in World War I, Nazi Germany unleashes the U-boats. And this is the beginning of a battle that will last for years. It is the Battle of the Atlantic. And they release hundreds of U-boats into the Atlantic, U-boats from Norway, U-boats from captured France, and their goal is to just destroy as much British shipping as they can. And if you look at that map, every single blue dot you see on that map is a dead British ship sunk by U-boats. And the Germans sink a lot of British shipping, and Britain begins to starve. He might not be able to bomb them into submission, but Hitler seems to be able to starve the British into submission. I mean, look at that chart on the lower left. That's, 500,000 tons of British shipping sunk. That's a lot of ships going to the bottom of the Atlantic. Now, Hitler thinks that Britain is isolated and on the verge of defeat. After all, he's just bombed the mess out of the cities. They are all slowly starving to death. Hitler then takes that huge German army and pulls it completely around. He pulls it out of France, leaving the occupation forces, and starts arranging it along the old Polish border. He deploys 3.2 million soldiers all along his border with Russia. And he pulls in the armies of the allies of Nazi Germany. He brings in the Italian army, he brings in the Hungarian army, he brings in the Romanian army, he brings in the Bulgarian army, and he is just preparing for this huge, massive attack against Soviet Russia. Now, the British tell the Russians this is coming. The British tell the Soviets, look, there are like more than 3 million soldiers on your border. They are preparing to attack. You have got to take this seriously. Stalin refuses to believe this. Stalin says, no, I've signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Act. I'm at peace with the Germans. We're trading with the Germans. We've had our differences in the past, but there is absolutely no way, Joseph Stalin thinks, there is absolutely no way that Adolf Hitler would betray him and launch a massive sneak attack on Soviet Russia. The sneak attack starts on June 22nd, 1941. It is a massive, massive smashing air attack. It opens up by blasting 6 Russian cities just into rubble. There's a cartoon of Hitler stabbing Stalin in the back. It is one of the largest land offensives in world history, and the Germans call it Operation Barbarossa. It launches in June 1941. The Russians are completely and totally unprepared. The German blitzkrieg tactics smash through the Russian lines. They encircle the Russian armies, and then they annihilate the Russian soldiers. They tear through the Soviet army like it is tissue paper. They just smash army after army after army. They capture city after city after city. It is an incredible gain. You can see in that map, they are just ripping through the Russians like nobody's business. And the thing is, as the Germans start to make their way across Eastern Europe, as the Germans start to make their way into Russia itself, the Russians initially hail them as liberators. Stalin is so hated by his own people that when the Germans show up, in those first few days, the Russians actually welcome the German soldiers. They're like, we're free of the communists. We're free. Thank you, Germans. And then the Germans begin to kill them in very large numbers. While they might have originally been welcomed as liberators, the Russians very quickly realize Hitler is much, much, much worse than Stalin. Again, to the Nazis, the Russians were Untermenschen. They're subhumans. They're not really people at all. The entire point of the German army is just to kill all of these worthless subhumans, to massacre them all in order to make the way for these German colonists to follow. They kill a lot of these people. Now, the numbers are quite disputed, but basically, in this early stage in the war, the Germans are already killing somewhere around 4 million Russians in this early stage of the war. And very quickly, the Russian attitude towards these Germans change. These are not liberators. They are all murderers. And this is the situation as we move through 1941. Germany has conquered almost all of Europe. The twisted cross of the German flag flies from France in the west to Libya in the south to Norway in the north to Russia in the east. And the German tanks look like they're on the verge of the final and complete defeat of Soviet Russia. America is not in the war. And the Americans were deeply divided about the war. For the most part, Americans did not like the Nazis. They do not like Nazis at all. All right? They found the Soviets to be absolutely awful. They thought Stalin was this complete thug. They really wanted to help the British, but at the same time, they don't want to go to war, all right? Americans do not want to fight a war in Europe. They'll help the British, but that's the extent of it. A particularly influential speaker is a fellow you've already met, Charles Lindbergh, that hero aviator from the 1920s. Now, he's particularly influential. He gives speech after speech after speech saying, we must be neutral. The European war is a war for Europeans. It is not a war for Americans. It is not our responsibility to save millions of people in Europe. It is not our responsibility to save all of the murdered Africans that were killed by the fascist Italians. He argues strongly against America entering the war. But the problem is that the Americans can look at these pictures. The Americans can hear the radio broadcasts, from London as the German Air Force is just trying to kill as many civilians as possible. And public mood is shifting. They want to see the Germans beaten, but they don't want to fight the war. And you have these wonderful movies, two of the greatest American movies ever made. Charlie Chaplin's The Dictator and Humphrey Bogart's Casablanca. And it reflects this deep division during this odd period in American history where they want to help, but they don't want to enter the war. Except some of them are saying, maybe we should enter the war. I mean, maybe the Nazis or the Imperial Japanese are something completely new, and we can't allow these things to exist. Charles Lindbergh says no. Charles Lindbergh says this is absolutely wrong. America should stay out of the war. We are neutral. We are not going to fight a war in Asia. We are not going to fight a war in Europe. And he calls all the people who are arguing in favor of helping England and all of the people capable who argue that we should fight on Britain's sides. He says, look, that's just the Jews getting to your brain. It's just the Jews that are trying to convince you that Nazi Germany is evil. Because Charles Lindbergh is a really good friend of the Nazi Germans. And in fact, they asked Franklin Delano his opinion of Charles Lindbergh, and FDR gives his opinion of Charles Lindbergh. He says, I am absolutely convinced that Lindbergh is a Nazi. All right. And, there's cartoons depicting Charles Lindbergh shoveling literally Nazi shit into America. There is Charles Lindbergh receiving a sword and a medal from high Nazi officials. That big fat guy on the right, that is the head of the German Air Force. That's the head of the Luftwaffe. That's the guy that ordered all those women and children murdered in Guernica. Now, Charles Lindbergh says, I'm not a Nazi. I'm not a Nazi. I'm just a good American, and I want America to stay neutral. But one of the things that doesn't help Charles Lindbergh is when he does like stupid crap like this, all right? Because Charles Lindbergh goes to these rallies. He goes to these Nazi rallies and he salutes the Nazi flag using the Nazi salute. This is not helping your case, Charles, because there are a small handful of pro-Nazi Americans. You can see this. They fly the Nazi flag next to the American flag. They say, why not peace with Hitler? Hitler hasn't attacked us. Why attack Hitler? Just leave Europe alone. Father Coughlin, the old anti-Semite from the Great Depression, Father Coughlin puts social justice on the side of the Nazis. And he says, look, it's those Jews that are trying to drag us into war in Europe. You can't trust the Jews, all right? The Nazis, they're not doing anything wrong because social justice is on the side of Nazi Germany. But while there are pro-Nazi Americans, there are even more Americans that are coming out against the Nazis. And one of the most beloved figures in American history comes out against the Nazis. This is that great war hero from World War I, Sergeant Alvin York. He was a Congressional Medal of Honor winner in World War I. He's this incredible hero. There he is meeting FDR. Now, Sergeant York, by the time we get to 1939, 1940, Sergeant York is old. Sergeant York is very sick. He's got diabetes, if I remember correctly. Sergeant York doesn't need any of this. Sergeant York doesn't need to go from city to city to city, saying, look, this war is going to swallow us, whether it comes now or later, it's coming. The Nazis represent something profoundly evil, and their evil has infected other nations of the world. The Nazis must be stopped. Sergeant York doesn't need to do any of this. He's a war hero. He's successful. He's old. He can just sit on his front porch and sip lemonade all day. But instead, this sick old man, this old war hero, goes from New York to Philadelphia, to Chicago, to New Orleans, to Atlanta, to San Francisco, to Los Angeles, giving speech after speech after speech. The war is coming, he says. We have to prepare for it, and we should enter the war on our terms, or something terrible is going to happen that will drag us into the war. And there is a young comic book artist that sees one of these speeches by Sergeant York, and he's particularly impressed, and he goes by the pen name Jack Kirby. And he's so inspired by Sergeant York that he basically gives Sergeant York a promotion and creates a comic book hero out of him. And that is how, at least in my opinion, Sergeant York becomes Captain America. And there is the comic book that's released, I believe, in 1940. And on its very first cover, Captain America is punching Hitler. And the American popular culture is turning against the Germans, all right? You have movies, Confessions of a Nazi Spy, in which clearly the Nazis are villains. And again, this is before Pearl Harbor, where we have January 1941, Superman in a comic book fighting the Nazis. This is all before Pearl Harbor. People are like, look, the Nazis are profoundly evil. Something must be done. But again, they don't want to go to war. And this is the weird balancing act that Franklin Roosevelt has to navigate. He wants to defeat the Nazis. They want to help the British, but they don't want to go to war. And what FDR does is he decides he's gonna do something very interesting. He is not going to take America into the war. Instead, he gives a speech. He says, America is not going to enter the war, but instead, we shall be the arsenal of democracy. And he gives this speech in December of 1940. And I want to read part of this speech to you. And the speech, more or less, goes like this. The people of Europe who are defending themselves do not ask us to do their fighting. They ask us for the implements of war, the planes, the tanks, the guns, the freighters, which will enable them to fight for their liberty and for our security. Emphatically, we must get these weapons to them. Get them to them in sufficient volume and quickly enough so that we and our children will be saved the agony and suffering of war, which others have had to endure. As planes and ships and guns and shells are produced, your government, with its defense experts, can then determine how best to use them to defend this hemisphere. The decision as to how much shall be sent abroad and how much shall remain at home must be made on the basis of our overall military necessities. America will not enter the war, but we must be the great arsenal of democracy. We're not going to enter the war, but we're going to arm and equip anyone who is fighting the Germans, anyone who is fighting the Italians, and anyone who is fighting the Japanese. And there is, in fact, a secret mission to arm and equip the Chinese to better fight the Japanese. And this is this incredible story of Claire Chennault and the Flying Tigers. There is General Claire Chennault right there. He's a Cajun. He's from my part of the world. And Claire Chennault resigns his commission as a general in the Army Air Corps. And he and about 50 pilots all resign together. And they are gifted the exact things that FDR talked about. Planes and shells and guns. They are equipped with these planes and they take all of these planes to China. And Claire Chennault says what the Chinese really need is air support. So Claire Chennault is going to take him and his American pilots and he is going to build a Chinese Air Force to counter the Japanese Air Force in mainland China. And here's one of the weirder things about the Flying Tigers. They're in Los Angeles. They're loading the planes on ships to move the ships across the Pacific to give them to the Chinese. And Claire Chennault and his pilots are going to train the Chinese to fly these, and they're going to fly these planes themselves. And everyone hears about this like secret but not secret mission because everybody knows about it. And a young animator who's had a few successes making these animated motion pictures hears, oh my goodness, Claire Chennault and the Flying Tigers are getting ready to leave Los Angeles. So he goes down, and this young animator, whose name is Walt Disney, meets Claire Chennault. And Claire Chennault goes, hey, and Walt Disney says, hey, can I design your logo? And Claire Chennault goes, okay. And that is how Walt Disney designs the Flying Tigers logo. There it is, right up above my head. And it's an emblem that they'll take into battle for the next 2 years. Now, in 1940, France has already been beaten by the Germans. So the Japanese go ahead and seize the French colonies in Asia. They seize French Indochina. And they begin to launch yet another series of additional attacks across China. Except this time, they're having to fight with the Flying Tigers all across mainland China. Now, FDR is not really that concerned about China. He doesn't like the atrocities that are taking place in China, but he's really concerned about Europe. FDR's eye is on Europe. It's the Nazis he's worried about, not Imperial Japan. So he basically says, look, we're just going to kind of like try to freeze Japan in place. We're going to order a general embargo against Imperial Japan. And FDR thinks that, look, that's just going to hold him in place. And while the Japanese are held in place, then I'm going to like totally rearm and re-equip, the British Navy and the British Army. And then the British are going to defeat the Germans. But the thing is that this general embargo that he places on Imperial Japan includes the one thing that the Japanese absolutely need. It includes the one thing that the Japanese cannot do without: oil, because there is no oil in the Japanese home islands. And without oil, the entire Japanese war machine runs out of gas. So Imperial Japan takes this embargo very seriously. Imperial Japan takes this embargo far, far more seriously than FDR does. So immediately Imperial Japan sends emissaries to Washington. And they're like, look, talk peace, 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 peace. But the whole time these diplomats are supposed to talk peace to FDR, the Japanese drop other plans. They're like, okay, if we're not going to get oil from the Americans, where can we get oil from? Well, there's a lot of oil in the Dutch East Indies, what today we call Indonesia. But back then, the Japanese just called it the Southern Resource Area. There's oil in the Southern Resource Area. But if we attack the Southern Resource Area, then the American fleet is going to come out and it's going to mess with us. It's going to fight us in Indonesia. In other words, to get the oil we need, so the Japanese think, to get the oil we need to seize the Southern Resource Area. But before we can seize the Southern Resource Area, we have to make sure that the American Navy is in no shape to stop us. In other words, we have to defeat the American Navy. And somebody goes, but the American Navy is 6,000 kilometers away. That's okay. Don't we have a military genius around here? They summon back Yamamoto. And they say, plan for an attack on the American fleet in Hawaii. And Admiral Yamamoto is basically like, that is a terrible idea. War with the Americans is the worst thing you could do. But they order him to do it. And Yamamoto is a faithful, loyal samurai. He will do it. And against his wishes, the Imperial Japanese government orders Admiral Yamamoto to draw up plans to cripple the American fleet. Thus, that will allow them the opportunity to seize the oil fields down in the Southern Resource Area. And that map on the left, that is Yamamoto's plan for the attack on Pearl Harbor. He doesn't envision it as a total surprise attack. He is assured over and over again by the Japanese government. He's like, look, I am not going to attack them in a surprise attack. They have to know that we're at war. And they're like, no problem. This is how it's going to go. The diplomats in Washington are going to deliver the declaration of war, and then the next day you're going to attack them in Hawaii. Yamamoto's okay with that. But again, the Japanese government lied to their loyal samurai admiral. And the Pearl Harbor attack takes place on December 7th. And that is the Japanese battle damage assessment that comes back after Pearl Harbor. It is far, far more successful than Yamamoto ever dreamed. They smashed the entire U.S. Navy. 4 battleships destroyed, 5 battleships heavily damaged, a dozen other ships smashed and broken, 200 planes destroyed, 2,000 soldiers, sailors, and pilots dead in the waters around Hawaii. It is an incredible Japanese victory. And as the Kido Butai, the elite Japanese carrier strike force, is sailing back to Japan, there is a celebration on board Yamamoto's flagship. All the staff officers, all the flight commanders, all the captains get together. They drink they hold up their rice wine. They toast the emperor. They say banzai, and they celebrate what they think is one of the greatest victories in Japanese military history. But Yamamoto refuses to celebrate. Yamamoto sulks off to one side. He just sips his glass of sake, of rice wine. He refuses to sort of engage in all of the celebrations. And as the story goes, he is approached by one of his aides, and they're like, Admiral Yamamoto, you are one of the greatest minds in Japanese military history. You have scored an incredible victory for the enemy. It's incredible. Come join us in all of our celebrations. And this is when Yamamoto gives this apocryphal quote, because Yamamoto is incredibly depressed about this greatest victory that he will ever win in his lifetime. And this is the apocryphal quote by Yamamoto. He says, I don't think we've won. I fear all that we have done is awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve. Now, the quote is apocryphal. Yamamoto never actually said that. It makes for a great story, but it's just not true. In fact, it is even more interesting what Yamamoto actually said. And that is what Yamamoto actually says. He is depressed. Yamamoto does not celebrate the greatest victory in 100 years of military history of Japan. And this is what Yamamoto says. A military man can scarcely pride himself on having smitten a sleeping enemy. In other words, like there's no glory in a sucker punch because, Yamamoto is a samurai. And Yamamoto continues, it is more a matter of shame simply for the one smitten. I would rather you made your appraisal after seeing what the enemy does, since it is certain that angered and outraged, he will soon launch a determined counterattack. Because Yamamoto doesn't think the Japanese have really won a victory at Pearl Harbor. Now, an answer in your brain should be forming. You should have the beginnings of an answer to that question on the lower left. And thinking about, was the Germany First policy actually good political and military strategy? Because America is now in the war to the hilt. They are in it to win it, and this is going to be total war for the next 4 years. But we're going to deal with that next time, and I will see you there.